Hey, what's going on? It's Johnny T Hoops Travelers. Like, share, subscribe to Hoopers Worldwide. We're coming to you live to a global audience. We have Jose Colorado in the house.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Johnny. Appreciate it.
If you have considered or considering hooping professional overseas, Jose is a 6-year professional playing in countries like China, Germany, Brazil, and Spain, just to name a few. He's going to be telling us about the ins and outs of playing professionally overseas. Jose, why don't you tell us what are some of the preconceptions of playing professional basketball overseas?
For me, one thing that I think a lot of players maybe can relate to is, for me, I didn't come from a big college. I didn't come from a big university. Actually, out of high school, I wasn't recruited at all. I had one offer. Well, I should say out of high school, I had 0 offers. So I took a gap year. And then after that, I had one offer to go to college. So from there, went to college, went to a very small college. It's called Quest University. It's in British Columbia, Canada. Really small town called Squamish. School population was like 500 people, like tinier than you can imagine. And, that was my only offer at the time, but I really loved basketball. So I decided that I was going to pursue it. I went to Quest, did well, played 4 years there. In my last 2 years, we were ranked nationally. So we went from completely, in my second year, for instance, we were 1 in 18. And then by my 4th year, we were ranked 5th in Canada, or we finished 5th in Canada. So we had a huge turnaround, did that. And then afterwards, I knew that I loved basketball and I wanted to pursue professionally. I just didn't know how to. There was no information really out there at the time. This is mid or early 2010s. So I tried to do it, made a lot of mistakes. Eventually, I ended up in El Salvador, and I was playing in El Salvador for a while. As you mentioned, played in Brazil, went to the USA, played in Germany as well. So all throughout my time there, when I was playing overseas, I would see a lot of players who were a lot more talented than I ever was. And I would see them that they would really struggle to try and progress their career. And I always wondered, how is it possible that this player is this good and he's unable to make that next step in his career? Or how is it possible that this player is this much better than me, just objectively looking at it? He's so much better than me, but yet I'm the guy who's making more than him. Or how is it possible that this guy wants to get to Europe and he can't get to Europe, but I'm getting to Europe? So then I started to think about it more, and I started to, really try and analyze it and study it. And, I was playing strong until COVID hit. And then once COVID hit, that's when I kind of reset, because everything kind of stopped in the world, including the basketball community, obviously. And that's when I started to really try to hone in on, how can I help players? Why are certain things happening the way they do? And that's when I started to create kind of this business where I'm trying to help players. I have a formula, I have a plan, I have a strategy that I'm trying to implement. And based on a player's profile, I believe that there is a path that each player can have that's going to pretty much maximize your chances of success, regardless of, your background, your skill set, where you're from. There's always going to be some sort of uniform path. And that's what I'm really trying to commit my time to and dedicate my time to right now. So long story short, that's basically my basketball career. I went from unrecruited to beating the odds and being able to play college, and then not even college professionally. And then now I'm just trying to help players. And hopefully we can get out information to players, doing podcasts like this, and also helping out players online and on YouTube and all these other things that it seems like the new generation uses a lot more. So, that's, long story short, what I've been trying to do.
Tell us about how U.S. players or players from Canada have advantages playing overseas, and tell us about some of the experiences that you've had, because you've broken records.
When I was playing in El Salvador, I was considered a national. I guess we can get into this later, but basically, when I was in El Salvador, I was considered a national player in that I was a Salvadorian, because my dad's from El Salvador. And because of that, I found myself at a big advantage over other nationals, because just objectively speaking, generally a player from North America is going to be, and if you grow up in the college system, you're going to be have the advantage over a player who are coming up in some of these other lesser basketball countries like El Salvador, for instance. So every day I would kind of be matched up with a Salvadorian when I was playing. So that allowed me to, just get off. I was, I think I had like four national scoring titles, 2 3-point titles, Latin Basket Player of the Year. So, all of that, it all worked to my advantage in that market because it was counted as a national. I was able to use it to my advantage. So yeah, that was a big thing for me early on in my career.
Preconceptions, assumptions. What are some of the expectations that you hear from players that want to play professional overseas?
The first one I would say is, the first one that everyone is curious about is always money. Like, how much money do you make? Who pays the most money? How much am I going to make? It's no coincidence that when I started my blog, I was doing like the SEO research, looking up everything. And the most commonly asked question on Google, always with overseas basketball, is how much do overseas basketball players make? How much do Canadian pro basketball players make? How much do whatever the country is, they're going to ask about it. So the big thing is players, a huge misconception is that players always think that you're going to make more than you will make at the beginning of your career. Now, if you're a higher end player, I'm talking about like high major Division I, you play for a national team, maybe something like that, mid-major, maybe D1. Those players, it's possible that they'll come out of college and they can make the type of money that maybe a typical player would be expecting. I'm talking about like 80,000 in a year, 90,000, over 100K, something like that. But for the vast majority of players, I'm going to say probably like 85% of players, you're going to be starting in the lower to mid tiers where you're going to be paying you much lower than you would expect. So when I was doing like my market research on all the overseas leagues, I was researching, I was talking to players, I was talking to coaches, I was talking to GMs all throughout the world. What I found was the average income for a beginner player is going to be somewhere between like $700 to $2,000 to begin per month, USD. So that means that when you're overseas, A, you have to be ready for that. And 2, you have to maybe be able to complement or supplement your income when you start. Because if you are coming out of college and you're 25 years old, maybe you have debt, maybe you have a kid, maybe you have whatever your life circumstances. If you come out of college and then all you're doing is you're dependent on your basketball income, well, if you don't like triple X that or 5X that within a year, then you're going to be in trouble. Because if you have debts, if you have a baby, if you have things you have to pay for, and then all you're making is $700, $800, $1,000 a month, you can see pretty quickly how you're going to be in trouble when you do that. So that's one of the biggest things. Players have to be ready for the money reality, and then also how they can like supplement and actually work with it, in the sense that being ready to get another job or just knowing what the pay structure is. The second thing that I would say, the second biggest misconception I would say, is that when you actually look at FIBA and overseas basketball, players assume that it's like the States where it's just the 12 best players and you get on a team. So if I go to Colombia, say right now you're based in Colombia, if I go to Colombia, a lot of players would assume, okay, I'm just going to go try out for that team. And if I'm one of the 12 best players, coach is going to pick me. But that's not how it works, because a lot of these FIBA leagues, well, all of the FIBA leagues, they have roster regulations. So they have imports and they have nationals, and then some of them have like in between, where it's like we won't get into that, but it's like an in between area. But so a national would be someone from the country. So for instance, when you're in Colombia right now, a Colombian would be a national. And the second designation would be an import, someone who's not from the country, someone who doesn't have a Colombian passport. So the vast majority of roster spots are going to be reserved for Colombians, obviously, because what's the point of an overseas league? The point is that you're building the national level of play in the country, that you're getting sponsors, that you're inspiring the youth, that players want to come up and play in the pro league, all these different things. So the vast majority of roster spots are always going to be with the host country. So for your instance, if there's 12 roster spots in a Colombian pro team, there might be 2 or 3 import spots. There's only 3 spots. You might think that if there's 10 teams, there's 12 roster spots per team. Okay, so 120 spots are available if my math's right. But it's actually only 12 times 3, which would be 36 spots are available, because there's only 36 import spots in the league. So that's a huge thing. Players think that It's just, if I'm good enough, someone's going to find me. But that's not actually the case, because it's much more difficult than that, because all of these leagues actually operate under these roster regulations. And that's a huge, huge thing that players just growing up just don't understand that. So there's ways that you can get around this. And one of the biggest ways, this would be the third thing that I would say, one of the biggest ways is that you have to use your nationality to your advantage. So if you have any sort of nationality, whether that's in Asia, Europe, Latin America, wherever it is, if there's a professional domestic league there, then that would be the first league that I would look at if I was a professional player. Because like I said, just like how the odds are going to be against you if you're an import, the odds are going to be with you if you're a national in that country. So previously I played in El Salvador, and that's where I started. That's by no coincidence, because I was trying to get in. I was messaging like Brazil, Colombia, Argentina. I had no idea what I was doing. These teams would never take a chance on me, because I come from such a small school. Even though I had a good college career, those guys are getting high-level imports who are experienced, who might come out of the NCAA ranks, and they would never take a chance on me. I'm just being honest. But that's not to say that you can't get there, but you first have to use and leverage your nationality status. So I started in El Salvador, and then, as you saw in my career, I moved on to Brazil, I moved on to Germany, I moved on to all these other places. And that's only because I started in El Salvador. So if I was going to boil it down to like 3 of the biggest misconceptions, it would be that the money, you have to understand your nationality status, and you also have to understand the roster regulations in each country that you're playing in, import versus national.
How important are highlight films opposed to going overseas and trying out?
Anytime that you can try out at a location, you're going to be at a huge, massive advantage, because a highlight video is basically just trying to show them exactly what you couldn't in person. The only difference is that you're not willing to invest on the flight or getting over there or just going in person. So there has to be some sort of bridge across from that. So you're trying to give them a highlight video. But if you're in person, then no longer do they have to question things like, what's the level of competition that he's played against? How does he move? How big is he? Is he in shape? If you just come over, say I went over to Colombia right now, and I said, hey, I want to try out for this club. And I said, hey, John Torres, I want to come try out for your pro club. And you said, sure, we're going to put you against our 12 players, and we'll see how you do in the scrimmage. All of the doubt surrounding a highlight tape is going to be gone, because if I just gave you my highlight tape, you might be like, okay, how good are these guys? Were they athletic? What were the circumstances? A highlight tape obviously it's a highlight tape, so it's your best plays altogether as well. Whereas if I just saw you, eyes on you, and you tried out in person, it's going to be, everything else is kind of melted away, because I can see with my own 2 eyes, the eye test, does this guy, can he compete at this level? Is he good enough to be an import? How does he compare to our nationals? All these different things. But don't get me wrong, a highlight tape is still extremely, extremely important, because obviously, just logistically speaking, we all can't afford a flight. Say I want to play in like 10 different countries, right? I'm not going to fly to France, fly to Germany, fly to Spain, fly to Portugal, fly to Colombia, fly to Brazil. It's just, logistically speaking, it's impossible, right? Because you're going to burn through so much money. So a highlight tape is really important, but the thing that could be like supersede or be even better than a highlight tape would obviously always be going out in person, trying out for the teams, and them actually seeing you and you making that connection in person.
Are there other ways that players could put themselves in front of owners and coaches?
So there's a few ways. It really depends on which region you're looking at. So for instance, a big thing that's kind of developed is exposure camps, but it's really important when players look at exposure camps, it's what location is it at, who's running it, do they have connections, when is it running in relation to when the season starts, how is it being run, is it against actual teams in the league, is it just against other imports, Americans who are playing, it's like an open gym. All of these questions players have to consider outside of just basically, if they obviously, the social media route, it is possible, but if you're a serious player, I would not depend on it at all. If you have serious aspirations of playing, then there's much better ways that you can get overseas. Now, obviously, when you're looking at exposure camps, that's going to be kind of like the steepest cost, because you're going to have to likely pay your flight over. You're going to have to likely, you might have to pay for your accommodations. You might have to pay for your cab to get to the airport or whatever, right? So, and you're going to have to pay the exposure camp as well, the fee for actually the owner putting it on. So, the barrier of entry is higher in terms of finances, but in the end, if it is a good exposure camp, then it could yield you better results than you just trying to do it from a distance and from afar. Because like I was mentioning earlier, anytime that you're in front of a team, anytime that you're in front of club owners in person, that's going to wash away all of their insecurities or all of their concerns about you as a player. So, exposure camps, the thing is with exposure camps, a lot of them, it really depends on the market, because in Europe, for instance, I know you're in Colombia, but for instance, in Europe, there's a few exposure camps that would work, and they do a good job in the sense that they actually let you go over there. You try out in person in front of teams, and you're not trying out in the States. That's the biggest thing. You have to think of location. You always also have to think of when, because if you're coming out, the majority of teams, if you're doing an exposure camp, they're not going to have the funds or the resources to be spending on multiple flights, to be spending on a high salary, all of these things. So they're going to be some of the lower end teams. So you have to keep that in mind. If your exposure camp is in, say, for instance, let's say it's in June, but the season doesn't start until like October, then that team is going to have to pay for another flight. But the thing is, a lot of the teams who are running these exposure camps, they're not going to have the finances for that. So you have to consider that as well. So you have to think, when is it happening in relation to the season? You also have to think, who is running it? Do they have connections to the league? Am I right in front of teams? All of these different things. So, that would probably be one way that players can get on. Obviously, there's other different ways, like all of these different things are going to add up. So if you know how to contact teams, when to contact teams, what to highlight in your player profile, how to properly do a highlight video. I'm not saying that if you're from a distance that you can't get on to a professional team. Obviously, there's tons of players that get on every year from a distance, from the States. But I'm just saying you have to actually properly know how to cater your message to specific teams. You have to understand where are your advantages as a player, as in where's your nationality, where are your connections, where you have most relevance as a player. So, all of these different things will help you. I see a lot of players, they really try and just depend on an agent or someone else to do all of the work for them. All they say is, hey bro, you got connections, can you put me on? It's like, it's much more complicated. You can't just put all your eggs in one person and say, hey bro, can you put me on? What is that person getting back in return for that? Because all of that time reaching out to teams, messaging teams, crafting your player profile, all of that takes time. And for me as a player, when I was playing, I would never want to put all of my trust, all of my future as a basketball player in a single person. I want to take the initiative. I want to take the control into my hands and see that I'm actually doing my part as well. Not saying that agents can't help you. Of course, agents are probably the most helpful if used properly. But the thing is, a lot of players think that somehow they're entitled to someone helping them out. They think that somehow someone is going to dedicate all of this time to them. But you have to think from the other person's perspective in the amount of time that they're investing into you, and ultimately what would be the payout for them. Because again, if you're a lower end player or a mid-tier player, even if you did have an agent, the payout in Fiba right now, the payout is 10% of the total contract. So like we were talking about earlier, let's say it's $700 to $2,000 is your opening salary. 10% of that, let's say it's a 5-month season. Let's say you make 2, 4, 6, 8, 10,000, 10% of that. Okay, so they're only gonna make about, I think it's $1,000 if my math is correct. They're only going to make $1,000 for all of that work that they're going to be doing. They're going to be messaging teams, reaching out to teams, going back and forth, trying to negotiate your contract. All of these things, that's gonna supersede any amount of hours that they can put into it. So that's why I say that it's difficult to work with an agent if they're not actually getting a big return on investment. And for a lot of these younger players, mid-tier, low-tier players, I would say take it into your own control. Do your own kind of research So you can do that through social media, like I was messaging. You can do that through emails, or you can do that through exposure camps. And there's many other different avenues as well. But those are just some of the more common, well-known avenues, I would say.
Can you tell us what are some of the biggest challenges that players face when they're going overseas?
So first time, some of the biggest challenges you're going to have is, we kind of touched on this earlier about imports and nationals, but one thing I didn't say, if you're a national, it's going to be easier to get into the league. But the other side of this is that when you're an import versus a national, if you're an import in the vast majority of countries, probably Europe is like the one exception when you get to like mid or high tier. But in the vast majority of these countries, when you're an import and you're only an import, the expectation on you is going to be enormous as an import. They're going to expect 30 points, 35 points, 40 points. You're going to guard the other team's best player. You got to get the nationals involved. You got to make them look good because they're trying to develop their nationals. You have to be a good citizen in the community. You have to win, obviously, most importantly. All of these different things, it is so much different than what you may be used to in your university or college system. And for some guys, that's great. For some guys, they may think like, oh, in college, the coach had the shackles on me and I couldn't actually do what I wanted to do. But the flip side of that is like, be careful what you wish for, because some of these expectations are crazy. They're going to be expecting 30 points no matter what. You're guarding the other team's best player. You got to have endless energy, get rebounds, all these different things. And a lot of players, it's like shell shock for them because, you know, before we went on air, John, we were talking about, there was some guy who came over to Colombia and he was like dropping 15 a game. And the owners are like, no, we don't need 15. We got nationals who can do 15. We need 30, 35. So, you know, that's a huge thing for a lot of players, is they do not realize the expectation and the kind of responsibility that's put on you as an import. Because if they are going to invest time in your flight, they're going to invest your food, they're going to invest in your salary, they're going to invest in where you live, they're going to invest all this money into you, then you better be 5x or 10x of what a national is capable of doing, because they're not getting that. Nationals aren't getting that. And if you're doing the same work as a national, then just logically they're going to think, well, why do we need you? Why do we need an American? We got this guy. We don't got to pay him food. We don't got to pay him accommodation because he has his own place here. He lives here. All we got to pay him is his salary, and he's going to do the same thing as you. So we can just slash that and get someone else who can do better than what you're doing. So that's a huge thing when you first go overseas, is the expectation. And along with that, obviously, when you talk about overseas basketball, a huge thing as well is going to be like the cultural barriers. And not only that, but the cultural barriers on the court, because you may think that referees are bad where you play, but you've seen nothing yet. Because once you get overseas, the nationals, the nationals, they're going to get the preferential treatment. The nationals, they're going to get the benefit of the whistle. And a lot of these times when you're going overseas, you can't even communicate with the referees. They don't know what you're saying. They're going to prefer the nationals. They're going to prefer the guys who they know. And the rules are much different. It's a lot more physical, I've noticed. There's not really much like nobility in overseas basketball, in the sense that sometimes they have guys who are just there to get in your head. Sometimes they have guys who are just there. I've had coaches telling me when I'm on the bench, I heard them say to one of my nationals, hey, go guard the American, get him ejected. And that's literally their only instruction to the player. Go get him ejected. So they go out there for 2 minutes and they're doing all types of dirty stuff. You know, it's kind of like a dark or dirty side to overseas basketball, but it's a reality. So you have to be really mentally strong when you're overseas. And your team is not going to care if a national is doing something dirty to you and you get ejected. At the end of the day, all they're going to say is, you got ejected. We need you to win, and you're not there to win because you can't keep your cool, and they're probably going to send you home after a few games if that happens repeatedly. Foul trouble, technicals, you can't play as many minutes as you can, you get ejected, any of these things. So that's a big thing as well, is that players have to be really mentally strong when they're playing overseas outside of. And then on top of that, outside, you also have all of the different cultural differences as well. You don't know where you are. You're away from your family. There may be a time zone. You can't communicate with people. You may not have many friends. So it's really different in that aspect, in that you're completely pushed out of your comfort zone. That's why I always say to players, when you're like training back home in the States or in Canada or wherever you are, always try to get away from your comfort playing area. So if you always go to like the one park or the one gym and you always run fives with the same people, get out of there. Go to another neighborhood where no one knows you. You got to do your own thing. You got to go on your own. Those 9 people or 10 people in that gym, they all know each other, but no one knows you. You have to prove yourself in that setting, and you have to go get it done. You know, all of these things are going to help you like train yourself mentally for the challenges that you're going to have, because it's really easy. I always say this, it's really easy to play well when you're in your comfort zone, when you're back home, when you're in a gym that you like, when you get to go to the bed that you like, when you get to see your family all the time. But that's not the reality. And that's a huge, huge part of overseas basketball. That's why when I see guys who are playing like 7, 8, 9, 10 years, it's just like so respectable to me, because it's so difficult when you're always moving from country to country to country, and there's all of these different expectations placed upon you, and you're always out of your comfort zone. So I would say that adjustment, I would say, you know, really get out of your comfort zone beforehand. And as well, the other thing, what was the first one I mentioned again? The first one was, the expectations on the nationals versus the imports. So those would be 2 big pieces of advice that I would give.
Can you give somebody your best advice to somebody who wants to play professionally overseas?
So if I was going to give them, like, let's say under a minute advice, like elevator advice, I would say, number 1, get your passport. Look into your passport as best as you can. Whether that's your parents, your grandparents, all of this is going to really help your chances of getting overseas, because it's going to make you a national versus the import. Number 2 is that I would really be on top of your basketball profile and your basketball highlight tape. So there's many different ways that you can make it, but I would say this: whenever you're contacting teams or trying to get overseas, I would always be under the impression that they have very little time. Because what I see a lot of players do is that they'll do like slow-mos in their highlight tapes. They'll build it up until like the 2 or 3 minute mark. But the thing is, the vast majority of coaches, agents, they're not gonna look at all that, because there's so many players. This is a huge market. There's more players than there are jobs. So you have to think in that mindset that it's always everything front loaded, everything up front, your best stuff up front. So when you're making highlight tapes, when you're making basketball resumes, I would say always put your best highlights up front. Always put your best foot forward at the start of it. Okay, so those would be, my first one would be get your passport, basketball highlight, and resume. Third one would obviously, you have to be or compete, I would say, at the best level that you can. So whether you max out at NCAA Division III, whether you max out at D2, D1, NEI, maybe a Canadian college, whatever that is, you have to try and get at the best level possible and put up the best stats and put up the best record and get good film in that sense. That's a really obvious one, but that's something that also has to be said. And the other thing was, when you are messaging teams, you have to tailor your message to specific teams or regions that are going to benefit you the most. So you have to have, in a sense, it's called like a reference point. If you have a connection in a certain area, if you went to school in a certain area where now there's a professional team, if you have a coach who's now overseas somewhere, if you have nationality, all of these things are going to be great reference points to the time when you actually reach out to teams and you can say that you want an opportunity to them. Because now, like I was saying earlier, that barrier is gone now between they don't know if you're good, they don't know if you're not. But now if you have a coach who can vouch for you and say, hey, this guy, I coached him for like 4 years in university, this guy can really play, we should get him, then that's going to be a lot easier versus you're just cold calling people. There's a lot of people think there's like a difference between cold calling in business and cold calling in basketball, but it's the same psychology. It's the same thing. I don't know you, you don't know me, I don't trust you. So how do you get past that barrier? So there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, and that's one way. And then another thing with number 5, I would say, would always be persistent. A lot of guys, they may get rejected by they'll like try for like 2 weeks and they won't get a reply, and they'll be like, oh man, I guess that's it. No one replied to me for 2 weeks. It's like, dude, this is such a competitive market. I don't think you understand. It's bigger than your city. It's bigger than your state. It's bigger than your country even. It's overseas basketball. You're literally competing with the world for these jobs. So you got to have a bit more perseverance and a bit more backbone than after 2 weeks you say, oh, it didn't work. You know, you have to keep constantly look, tinker, switch up your style, see where new advantages could be, and you never know when something might open up. So that's why I say number 5 would have to be, you have to be really persistent. Because just a quick story, I had a friend who he was playing in the Asian League in Asia. Okay, so he was playing with the Macau Black Bears. And when he was there, they were playing in this league, this big profile tournament in Asia. And then the league shut down because of COVID. And then he kind of like couldn't get on a team because he didn't really have like national status anywhere. He had a form of, I think he had Chinese parents or something, but China doesn't actually recognize dual citizenship. So he couldn't actually get dual citizenship in China and in Canada. So the problem was he was basically out of a team. And for like 2 or 3 years, he was just kind of training, doing his thing back home. And then sure enough, this past year, something opened up where the PBA actually entered a guest team from Hong Kong, and they allowed players who have just Chinese ancestry, like a Chinese parent, they allowed players like that to be a Chinese or a heritage player, they said, an Asian heritage player. So you never know what's going to happen, you know what I mean? But if he gave up after that 1 year and he's like, oh, well, the league canceled because of COVID, I guess now I'm going back to what I do. Then it's going to be hard for you. You know, it's definitely not for the weak. Overseas basketball, you got to be persistent. And that's what I mean. There's things that are constantly opening up, constantly changing. You never know when someone's going to be in a new position of power. You never know when something new is going to open up, when leagues open up, anything like that. So I would say, you know, passport, resume and highlights, emailing and tailoring your messages with great reference points, specifically to certain reference points, then also being very persistent in this and seeing and actually being in tune with what's changing in the market. So that would be like the 5 quick overview steps of overseas basketball that I would say.
Oh man, thank you, Jose, for joining us. I know that hoopers are gonna get a lot out of this. You could go back to the video, hit rewind. Again, thank you for the great insight. You can learn more about Jose Colorado at josecolorado.com. Hoops Travelers, travel the world with us. Be the script. It's getting good. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Johnny, for having me. If anybody is interested in following me or maybe looking more into overseas basketball, you can find me at josecolorado.com. I'm also pretty active on Instagram. That's going to be Colorado URB on Instagram and on Twitter. And as well, I have a YouTube channel. It's just Jose Colorado, and I try and give overseas basketball advice to any players who are interested. It's all free, all for your education, all for the benefit of the players. And I just appreciate you, John, for letting me have this platform and, you know, bringing this out to players. And, you know, hopefully more players can learn, and hopefully more players in the future can have an easier path to realizing their goals, because overseas basketball is one of the best times, I can promise you, one of the best times you'll have in your life. So thanks so much. God bless and peace.